studied that plants have two types of tissues. Can you name them for me? What are they called? Dividing tissues and non-dividing tissues, right? Absolutely correct. Now let us look at the technical terms for these tissues. In this lesson, we will look at the former type of tissues. The dividing tissues in plants are known as the meristematic tissues. Where does the word meristematic come from? It comes from the Greek word meristos, meaning divided. Well, the main function of this tissue is to divide and help the plant grow. So where do you think you will find this tissue? Exactly. They are at all the places where the plant's parts show growth. And as we just studied, all the parts of the plant do not show growth. Growth is restricted to only certain parts of the plants. What's interesting is that meristematic tissues is named differently based on the part where it is found. And do you know how many such parts of plants have meristematic tissues? 3 different parts. That's correct. 3 different parts have meristematic tissues. The meristematic tissues in each of these parts has different names. Let us look at the 3 main types of meristematic tissues. The first is the apical meristem, the second is the lateral meristem, and the third is the intercalary meristem. Do not be let down by these difficult names. Let me make them easy for you to understand. Apical meristem tissues are found in the growing tips of the stems and the roots. This tissue divides and helps increase the length of the plant. What about the second one? Lateral meristem? Do you know where it is found in the plant body? The word lateral means side to side, and this means the girth of the plant. The lateral meristematic tissue divides and increases the girth of the plant. Apical increases the length and lateral increases the girth. This girth of the plant is also known as the cambium of the plant. What about the last tissue type? Intercalary? Where is this tissue found? This tissue is found at the base of the leaves or the internodes. These spaces here are known as the nodes. What do you think this tissue will do? They will facilitate the growth of the twigs into branches. As these tissues are very active, the cells in these tissues are filled with cytoplasm. They require a lot of energy and nutrition to carry out the various functions of the tissues. But do you know something interesting? At the initial stages, these tissues are not differentiated into any specific types. Once they divide and mature after completing the growth of the plant, their characteristics change. Then they are differentiated into components of a single tissue. Division of labor takes place only after maturity. Until then, all the meristematic tissues exhibit the same function of simple growth of the plant. If these are the characteristics of the dividing tissues, what about the non-dividing tissues? Let us study them in our next lesson.
Hey, Misharaki Mishari, only step is.
What did we study in our last lesson? We studied about meristematic tissues, right? Now tell me one thing. Do plants also have permanent tissues right when they germinate from seeds? Permanent tissues are composed of cells that have lost the power of dividing. That is kind of out of place, right? The plant is growing and thus must have only meristematic tissues. Permanent tissues would mean tissues that are already present and those that do not divide. So initially, if the plant does not have permanent tissues, where do they come into the picture? I am sure this is a mind-boggling question. The answer is actually quite simple. When meristematic tissues have divided and reached the final stage of division, they attain maturity. After this point, these tissues do not divide anymore. They only get differentiated into different parts, and these non-dividing tissues then become permanent tissues. Did you understand what this means? It means both the meristematic tissues and permanent tissues are one and the same. When tissues grow and divide, they are known as meristematic tissues. And when they finally mature and divide no more, they become permanent tissues. So permanent tissues are nothing but matured meristematic tissues. Do you know there are mainly two types of permanent tissues? Can you take a guess at their names? Yes, they are simple tissues and complex tissues. We will look at the simple permanent tissues in detail. The very word simple means they have a very simple structure. All the cells of a simple permanent tissue are almost the same. Do you know that there are three subtypes of the simple permanent tissue? Yes, and do you want to know what they're called? Parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma are the three types of simple permanent tissues. If you must know in one word what each of these tissues do, let us see what they can be called otherwise. Parenchyma can be called a filler tissue. Collenchyma is a supporter, while sclerenchyma is a protector tissue. We will look at each of these tissues in detail in our coming videos. Stay tuned. In the previous video, we glanced at the simple permanent tissues. And now, before moving ahead with the complex type, we need to stop by the concept of epidermis, the single layer of cells covering almost the entire plant body. We humans need a layer of skin to protect our internal visceral organs and systems, right? Plants are not an exception to this. They also require and possess a protective covering throughout their body, which we refer to as the epidermis. So do you think all plants will have the same structure and same type of epidermis layer? Well, actually not. Epidermis gets modified depending upon the habitat and thus the plants need. Let me ask you a question. What would plants growing in dry habitat need the most? Yes, water. In case of such plants, the epidermis forms a thicker layer in order to prevent excessive water loss. In fact, plants growing in desert have a thick vacuole called cutin in their epidermal cells, which prevents water loss to the maximum extent. On the other hand, in terrestrial plants, usually the aerial parts have epidermal cells specialized in waxy secretions, and it helps in numerous ways, like preventing parasitic infection, protection against mechanical injuries, and even loss of excessive water during high temperatures. In addition to this, when we observe the roots of plants, we find tiny, numerous hair-like structures. These are also the modifications of the epidermal cells, which help in increasing the surface area of absorption. Talking about their structures, now since they are forming a protective layer, it is obvious that they do not possess intercellular spaces. Also, the cells are very flat in appearance and possess a comparatively thicker outer cell wall. Wait a second. Are you saying that the complete plant body has a layer of epidermis? Then how does the gaseous exchange along with the water vapor release occur? Well, the epidermis is clever enough to leave some spaces or precisely pores in its structures. Yes, the structures of pores, which we commonly refer to as stomata, are the spots where the epidermal cells form pits or openings and are guarded by the kidney-shaped guard cells. The guard cells guide and regulate the exchange of gases and also the water vapor from the stomata. Well, till now, we have been talking about the leaves and roots. Now let's talk about the stem. Do you think the stem will also possess the same type of epidermal layer as that in the leaves and roots? Actually not. In fact, stems of huge trees do not even possess a proper epidermal layer. Yes, you heard me right. In plants older, the epidermis is replaced by secondary meristem, which we usually refer to as the thick cork or simply the bark. Cells of these layers are dead and compactly arranged without intercellular spaces. Also, we find deposits of suberin, which regulates gaseous exchange and water loss. Well, this video gave you a brief idea about epidermis. Now let's move ahead and describe complex